Hey, everybody. Today I'm going to interview Dr. Richard Kim, and we're going to talk about Confucianism and well-being. All right, Richard, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to your YouTube channel. It's really good to see you again, Jason. Yeah, so my name is Richard Kim. I'm an associate professor at Loyola University Chicago. Uh, I work on ethics and moral philosophy more generally, but I focus especially on classical Chinese texts. Although I draw upon a wide variety of traditions, including ancient Greek philosophy, sometimes medieval philosophy, especially Aquinas. But I'm mainly interested in issues having to do with moral psychology, especially concepts like emotion, virtue, character, well-being, and happiness, and so on. I went to UCLA for my undergrad. I went to University of Notre Dame for my PhD. Currently, I live in South Bend, Indiana, near Notre Dame, where my wife teaches, and it's just a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So you recently published a book, right? What is it called? Confucianism and well-being?
Yeah, Confucianism and the philosophy of well-being. It comes out of my background in research into well-being. So that was my dissertation project, where I looked at various theories of well-being, which is, of course, what you also worked on when you were a graduate student.
Yeah. So I am excited to learn more about it. Well, what is the general argument of the book?
Well, the general argument of the book is really offering an account of the conception of well-being that we find in the classical Confucian texts. So I try to reconstruct an account of well-being that we find in these significant Chinese texts, especially the Analects of Confucius, another text known as the Mengzi and the Shunzi. So the account of well-being that I developed really centers around these three Chinese texts, which have had an enormous influence on East Asian philosophy for over 2,000 years. And so I try to identify the various elements of well-being that I find to be of philosophical interest and significance, and to try to make a case for why those central elements of well-being that we find in those texts should be carefully considered, why they might be worth thinking about, even from our own 21st century Western perspectives.
Okay, so what does Confucianism say about well-being?
Well, I think first of all, it's good to note that these are old texts, right, over 2,000 years, and so you don't find necessarily some explicit statement like, here is the account of well-being that will, attach to the Confucian tradition. In a way, the historical development of Confucianism itself is very complicated, somewhat messy. But what I'm trying to do is find or identify clear prudential goods, let's call them, or goods about well-being that these various Chinese thinkers try to explain, develop. So I guess one question to ask here is, yeah, what did they think were important ingredients of well-being or the good life? So one central element of well-being that I find really interesting is ritual. So ritual, or li in Chinese, plays a central role in the Confucian tradition. They thought rituals were necessary and perhaps not sufficient, but central and primary to a good life. And that's not a concept that we find, for example, discussed widely in contemporary theories of well-being, at least from the Western perspective, which you're familiar with. So yeah, what would be a kind of analog there? I'm not sure, but ritual practice, development of certain habits and dispositions connected to the practice of rituals is deemed to be really important for the Confucians.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's dive a little deeper into that because personally, I'm not really a fan of rituals, but it might be because I have a different conception of what a ritual is. So, for instance, particular celebrations, like like a graduation ceremony, or putting up a Christmas tree, right? Or eating turkey on Thanksgiving. Like
Mhm.
those certain things I don't really value. I don't personally do those things, and I don't see anything wrong not doing those things. So maybe they have a different conception of a ritual.
Yeah, maybe they do. So first of all, rituals are very broad ranging. So they would count those kind of, I mean, so you just identified something like graduation, which is a kind of large scale ceremony. A lot goes into a graduation ceremony. And to be honest with you, I think I did go to my graduation for my undergrad, but I didn't go to my graduation for my PhD.
Yeah, I didn't go either.
Yeah, I didn't really care that much either. I never bought the robe. They're $1,000, as you know, very expensive. Yeah, and you also mentioned like Thanksgiving turkey, putting up the Christmas lights. So those are a little bit on a different scale, of course. But yeah, for the Confucians, rituals were very broad ranging. So they would count things like perhaps a graduation, wedding, you could think of that. Funeral is also a very important ritual for them. But also they thought there are everyday rituals. And for example, one that's relatively widely discussed is something like a greeting. So I actually use this in my own class when I teach my students about Confucian rituals. So think about like a handshake, right? Maybe they're coming back after COVID. I don't know. Are handshakes coming back? I'm not sure. We kind of went to fist bumps, but it doesn't matter that much exactly the particular detail. In the Korean culture that I'm familiar with, we bow a lot, right? So although I think they do handshakes nowadays, but think about just a simple handshake. So what goes into a handshake? Well, you might think it's pretty easy, right? You just put out your hand and you grasp the other person. But actually, if you're not used to that ritual, you need to have a certain social understanding. You need to have, because you can have a bad handshake. You can have, right? And I'm sure you've experienced it, right? You can have someone who does a handshake that's too limp, maybe too aggressive, maybe they get in too close. There's a certain kind of understanding there, a certain norm. But also, what that simple ritual conveys is a kind of, I think there's something deep going on. It conveys a certain respect, right? You don't shake hands with other creatures, really. And a greeting is actually very important. If someone doesn't greet you that you can easily feel slighted. You can feel disrespected, which can lead to enormous consequences, right? Great works of literature have been built up just by these simple, a failure to participate in simple things like this. For example, if you ever watch Godfather, right, it centers around this idea of respect. And human beings need these things. Generally we have this built-up psychology evolved through millions of years. And so I think what the Confucian rituals do, at least at one level, is to satisfy these deeper kind of desires we have in our psychology, the desire for respect, the desire for recognition, acknowledgement. So that little simple ritual of greeting, however it became manifested in a specific culture, can play an enormous role in keeping social ties together, building up human relationships. So I think for Confucians, the rituals are deeply centered around social values of harmony, of coordination, and building up of a good community, and mitigating, chaos, friction, and so on. So that's, and I think we might think of graduation ceremonies as also functioning maybe in a somewhat of a similar way. I mean, what's tough in our American culture is we're so pluralistic, right? We have such wide-ranging views, and we're such a big place, right? A very cosmopolitan place in terms of the history of the world. That maybe it's a little bit harder for us to see this, but at the local level, these rituals, I think, maybe play a deeper role than we might have assumed. Or I mean, even funerals, right? What do funerals do, right? They mark out a certain important event. Everybody dies, and they can have deep emotional consequences and implications. And so the Confucians, I think, recognize that these are deep, profound human events, right? A funeral is not the same thing as just going to the bathroom on a normal day, or just a mundane task or chore like sweeping the floor. Funerals carry a huge significance, especially if it's someone you love. And so I think they also recognize that certain events are more profound, more meaningful, and we need a way of sort of organizing that event in our life, attaching a certain meaning or significance, perhaps. And so I think even if we disagree about maybe particular rituals, like maybe Thanksgiving turkey is not necessary, but there's a part of us that also wants a certain kind of, meaning attached, right? Certain kind of memories are tied to experiences. and they can, bring up certain emotions. And so I think they're trying to find a way of I don't know, maybe giving sense to these sometimes messy experiences in human life.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. And I guess valuing rituals doesn't say anything about what those rituals ought to be, right? So a Confucian could say like, "Oh yeah, you don't necessarily have to do this particular ritual. It just happens to be the case in my country, but whatever your ritual is, it has some sort of value. And perhaps some rituals are more important than other rituals, maybe."
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So the ritual, the specifics can be vary, but I think they think that something like a funeral ritual will be rooted or anchored in some deep feature of our psychology, where it's not just because you're Korean or Nigerian or Brazilian that you can kind of see the significance of a ritual, although it might be practiced differently. But we know that the passing, the dying of someone we really love is a profound human experience. And I've never been to Brazil, but I would think if we went there and then someone's mom that they love just died, they would be puzzled if you said, "Well, why is that important? You just go to work the next day, right?" I'm pretty sure that's not the way they think of it, and they would be maybe even offended, and maybe rightly so, if we put that kind of event, that kind of momentous and deep event, as something just as mundane as washing dishes or something like that.
Okay, interesting. So, what else about Confucianism do you think is interesting when it comes to well-being?
Another part or another feature of human life that they think is really essential is family. So Confucians are sometimes what they call like a collectivist culture, or imbibe a collectivist culture and identity. So their conception of like the fundamental unit of a society isn't really the individual, like me or you, where we're protected by individual rights. Let's say in a modern liberal democracy, they thought the fundamental unit of a society is our families. So it's a very different way we might think of ourselves, which I mean, that's not the way I, really think of myself. I think of myself as an individual, maybe most fundamentally, although I'm part of a family and it's very important to me. But they thought families are kind of has a kind of primacy, and so what you get is certain values, like, and here's a famous one that some people might be familiar with, but that you should know, which is filial piety. So that's a really central concept in the Confucian tradition, which has to do with respect for parents and elders, and that's certainly not a very modern notion, right? That's a very important notion still, I think, in East Asia, but from our sort of Western American perspective, it's not a value that we really grow up with that often. It's a kind of older classical East Asian value. Now, one question we might raise as philosophers still is, well, is that a good value, right? Just because people have values does not mean that they're therefore good, right? Maybe it should be rejected, or maybe it should be revised or altered, or maybe there's some important element to it that is worth sustaining. That could be true as well. So insofar as we're doing philosophy, we should call them into question and examine them carefully. But my stance is usually when there's a value that is such a central part of a whole tradition for 2,000 years, I think a good default position is to assume that there's something of value and then try to see what that value is. Like, I like to ask that kind of question to my students. Like, why is it that they thought family and filial piety, this kind of respect for elders, was so crucial for a good human society or community? Like, why would they possibly have thought that? And so, yeah, and then my students usually give some various answers. It's interesting because some of my students, they come from backgrounds from certain parts of Africa and also Latin America. And they tend to, those students actually are usually the ones who tend to more quickly recognize, or at least acknowledge, that they see some deep value there that they grew up with. Maybe because those are more collectivist societies, I'm not sure, compared to like American modern society. So yeah, why is it so important? I think, one possibility is, and this is not necessarily just the Eastern value, because we find it, like, for example, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? In the Ten Commandments, there's a commandment to, honor your father and mother, right? It's a very famous commandment. And why is that? I think like maybe what some of those the people from both both the Judeo-Christian and the Confucian tradition, maybe one thing that they saw was in order for a society to be stable and organized and structured over time, you need people that to some extent are willing to follow the norms of the given society or culture and be willing to kind of go with what are accepted by most people. So like laws, rules only have value if they're generally followed. Now, of course, maybe from like, if you talk to a college student or younger folks, or maybe even from our more, from our modern perspective, we might go, yeah, but that can also lead to bad conformity, right? Obviously, people living in the Nazi times followed that culture and look where it led them. And so those would be fair criticisms, I think. And we got to watch out for that. But generally, there is also tremendous value in recognizing that in order for a society to function, there needs to be some conformity. We need to be able to line up when, others are lining up. If you always rebel and go against the established order, that's usually, and if everybody does it, that will lead to an extremely bad society. That's not going to work. So generally, we're willing to line up. We're willing to, let people, who are in front of us go ahead. And to some extent, I think maybe the Confucians thought there's a kind of wisdom of the ages that kind of build up over time. And so our parents, they're, of course, they're humans, they're flawed, but they also have some understanding of what's necessary for human life. And some of the major parts of our human life needs to go well in order for us to flourish, even to thrive, even for creativity, right? We need a certain kind of background of stability. Like a jazz musician needs to learn the classical traditions, perhaps, or need to understand what went before in order to then improvise and create their new modes of playing. So I think that's part of what the Confucians were sort of good about. They've really cared a lot about tradition, stability, structure, and of course, like then we could talk about how that needs to be kind of maybe I don't know, integrated with also a kind of more progressive mindset, because you do need sometimes change and you need sometimes people calling out things of the past order that needs to be revised, right? But that's, I think, what they were focused on. And just one last quick thing, because I've been talking for a while, but Confucius himself, the history there is that when he came onto the scene, the society that he was born into was kind of chaotic. There was a lot of war, there was a lot of disorganization, there was territorial disputes. And so he came on the scene at a time when there was a fair bit of instability in society and chaos. And so I think he really thought we need to, because he lived at that time, he, I think, wanted to establish a bit more harmony, maybe more structure into societies. And so I think he was sort of biographically more attached to kind of those rules, maybe not so much as rules, but values that kind of help to create a more stable order. So he was very much focused on virtues and rituals that would help restore some of the order that he thinks had been lost over time.
Well, thank you for that. So I guess I'm trying to see the distinction here between respecting your parents and following traditions, right? Because you can respect your parents in the sense that you heed their advice. You can respect your parents in the sense that you take care of them when they're old, right? That's a way to like honor them and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is following like traditions, right? Like I can see how they kind of overlap, but I can also see how they don't overlap, right? The second question, which is related, is that it seems like it's a conception of societal well-being and not a conception of individual well-being. Like, how does it make my life better for me to respect my parents?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That would be my question. I can understand why pleasure would make my life better. I can understand, all the instrumentally why vitamins would make my life better. But just in virtue of respecting my parents, maybe it's because, well, my parents are older. They know more about life. And so they are wiser. And so instrumentally, it is good for me to listen to wise people.
Right. But that wouldn't be like an intrinsic benefit. It would be more of an instrumental benefit.
Correct.
Because you have someone that gives you good, well-being advice and you follow it, and then you have more well-being.
Yes.
But it's not the following the parents themselves that increases your well-being in and of itself. So that's a good point. So I think maybe to a large extent it is something like that, but also, one thought I was toying with in the book, and which a question that I've had for a long time is, the way that our individual well-being is connected to the well-being of others, right? So a lot within contemporary philosophical investigation into well-being, usually the discussion does center around what is it, what does my well-being consist in, right? Like what does Richard Kim's well-being consist in, or what does an individual's well-being consist in? And then we have different theories, like it's about pleasure, or it's about desire fulfillment, or it's about achieving certain objective goods, or it's about developing and exercising one's nature as a human, right? So you get different views, right? Um, it seems to me like generally the Confucians think, and I've talked to some other ancient Greek scholars, and they think that maybe Aristotle had a similar view, which is in a deep way, your own individual well-being. And I'd be interested in seeing how you might maybe better articulate this idea, whether you agree with it, which is your individual well-being is deeply bound up with the well-being of others. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it means there's some non-instrumental connection between my well-being and, let's say, my child's well-being. And if you look at the psychological literature, there's also this interesting phenomenon. Like if you lose someone you love, people will describe it as like losing a part of themselves, right? Like losing like a limb. And so you might think, well, obviously my hand is a part of me. Well, yeah, in one sense, right? That's part of my physical body, and that's part of me in some sense. But people are willing to think of people that they love as part of them. Like if they do badly, they're willing to say that, yeah, their life goes worse in and of itself. Like in virtue of the fact that my child's life goes terribly, my life also goes worse. But, one might question that and say, well, maybe instrumentally it goes worse, right? Because you feel sad and you feel you're in pain when your child dies, let's say, or is suffering. But I think for a lot of people, and myself included as a parent, if my kid does badly, I don't think it's merely instrumentally bad for me. I think there's a deeper sense in which my life goes worse for me. So, and maybe that's a kind of a controversial point. Maybe it's not as intuitive for some people, but at least I think for a lot of people, maybe even ordinary people on the street, I think that is how they think of their own well-being. You can't just go, well, yeah, okay, but let's hold off on your child's well-being. Just talk about your well-being. But for a lot of people, I think they might say, well, I don't understand that thought. Like my well-being is constituted, at least partly, by the well-being of people I love. Like their well-being directly and inherently affects my well-being. And
Yeah.
so, I wonder how that story would unfold, or if seen from that perspective.
So that makes sense. I guess my initial response is going back to this conception of what respecting your elders means, right? Because again, you can respect them by heeding their advice, and that doesn't necessarily mean that their well-being is affected by that. Not necessarily,
Right.
depending on what the advice is, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
if it's the case that if you don't heed their advice, their well-being lowers, and therefore your well-being lowers, then that's one
Right.
thing,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if the other, yeah, so I don't know if it's necessarily that type of relationship. I think it will depend on the type of advice. And I think the more interesting point is, what if your well-being is tied to not respecting your parents, like because your parents were bad people?
Right. Right. Yeah. So I think so okay, so sorry. So yeah, you were really focusing on the heeding of the advice. Well, first of all, if it's bad advice, you should not follow it, I think. But like so I suppose the general thought here is there's a certain virtue attached to being a good child, even if you're an adult child, right? So I'm an adult, I'm 40 years old, I still have parents. And I think the Confucians really thought there's a certain virtue to being a good child. And if that's true, and they think that virtues are a constituent of well-being, which, a lot of people do, they think being a good person is a part of well-being. Now, that's, controversial, but certainly the Aristotelians thought that, and the Confucians think that as well. So it's not a wild view at least. So if you think being a good person, being virtuous is an important part of well-being, and you think that one central virtue is being a good child, or filial piety or something like that is a virtue, then maybe that's one way that the story would unfold, right? For why heeding your parents' advice is good, because maybe it's wrapped up with being a good child. Now, I think like if your parents don't have, maybe suffering from a mental illness and they think, you should jump off a bridge. I mean, I don't think the Confucians would say, oh yeah, that's right. To be a good child, you got to now go jump off the bridge. That seems like, overly simplistic. So I think the story will become a bit complicated. So it can't just be heed all their advice, right? So I think that's not quite right. But really, the central idea here is having a good relationship with your parents and seeing them as your parent, and to having some disposition to follow them in some way, especially when you're a child. Is I think they think that they do think that as a good disposition, maybe and in some way connected to virtue as they conceive of it.
Okay, so maybe like in general, it is good to respect your parents, but they can grant exceptions. Like if your parents are bad people, like if they abused you as a child, then it could very well be the case that what you ought to do as the child is just kind of alienate them and ignore them.
Yeah, although to be honest, when you look at the text themselves, that's not really the way they what they would usually say. I think I think you and I would say that we live in 2023. I think we have a very different perspective on this. They actually, even in the Confucian tradition, they knew that their parents could be bad, right? Um, uh, they actually, yeah, they knew that parents could be awful, and family could be awful, but for whatever reason, they do tend to be very deferential, and they think you should go to a pretty extreme degree, especially from our perspective, to still respect your parents, even if they're kind of crappy people. And it's interesting, like, yeah, you might think, well, why, right? Like, yeah, for example, there's a famous passage where, Mencius is asked, well, what if, a virtuous person, his father murders, right? Like, what should that person do? And Mencius says something like, well, and actually, the story is about the Sage King, this very virtuous historical person. And Mencius says, well, that Sage King, the exemplar, moral exemplar, would, probably just, concede his throne and take the father away, and just live out his days serving his father. Just let go of his kingdom, let go of everything, all the money, all the power, and just take care of the father, even though he did something terrible. So that sounds extreme. I think that sounds very extreme, and I think few of us would be willing to do that. And you might even wonder, well, that's bizarre. Maybe Mencius, this important classical Confucian, just maybe he was too much into the group of that kind of ideology. But I don't know why. Yeah, why did they think? I think they thought virtue, being filial piety, was such an important virtue. Being respectful towards your parents was extremely important. Maybe because they thought, well, you owe them your life in some sense. They took care of you when you were, and I have several kids, and when you're a baby, you are absolutely dependent. And so maybe they thought gratitude required that. Maybe those kinds of things. But I'm not entirely sure myself. But they really do lean toward that respectful route, much more so than I think a lot of us would go.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so I have some passages of Confucianism picked out, and I thought it'd be interesting for you to explain what these passages mean.
Okay.
All right, so the first passage says this: the way lies in what is near, but people seek it in what is distant. One's task lies in what is easy, but people seek it in what is difficult. If everyone would treat their kin as kin and their elders as elders, the world would be at peace. All right, what does that mean?
Good question. That's a very famous passage from the Analects. And I mean, there's multiple components to it, right? So I like this one part, the initial part, where in the Analects, so what's going on there is Confucius seems to be saying a lot of people look outward, like far away in a distant, but there's all kinds of things that we can do, at a more local level. So I think this is actually a kind of important point today, where, and maybe like a kind of criticism of certain people who are more kind of progressive minded, because they tend to emphasize like the global, right, like poverty, or the global like injustices, like going off at a distant country. And but then like I sometimes wonder, like, but there's problems where you are, right, in your community, in your city. There's homeless people, there's people who need help. And so I do think that there's something bad if and there are people like this, and maybe we're all guilty of it in some ways, and where we kind of like talk a big talk about helping at a global level, we don't really do enough for the people who are near to us, right? Maybe we treat our own family members, or even like people within our own neighbors like crap. But then we talk this big game about justice, right? And I think Confucius here might be criticizing something like that kind of attitude, instead of sort of working maybe on yourself also, or working to improve at a more local level where you can make more improvements. Sometimes people are too outwardly focused. That might be part of it. I think he thinks that really virtue and goodness is built up by treating people well that you see on a day-to-day basis. That, if you think you can just be virtuous because all you do is read about injustices in another country, you're not really doing much. That's not what we might call the hard work. The hard work is developing the virtues, living well on a day-to-day basis, cultivating generosity, and courage, and doing what's right, every day, instead of just kind of outwardly focused. I think something like that seems to be part of what he's saying. And he's saying you have ample opportunities here to treat others as like your own family, even strangers, right? And so you can really do quite a bit to cultivate the self where you are. I think that might be just part of the practical advice there.
So when it says the way, is that referring to the way to live a good life?
Yeah. So the way, or the Tao, right? That's kind of this important Chinese concept. Usually means translated as something like path or the way, and you find this throughout the Chinese traditions. So the way is really the proper path, the proper way of living well. And so that's the kind of that is how you should live, carry out your life. That's basically what he's referring to there.
All right, let's do another passage. The master said, eating plain foods and drinking water, having only your bent arm as a pillow. Certainly there is joy to be found in this. Wealth and eminence attained improperly concern me no more than the floating clouds.
Great. So it's interesting. One of the things I think you find throughout, not only in this important classical Chinese text, but throughout even the ancient Greek traditions or the Western traditions, is that the wise people seem to think that human beings tend to place way too much weight on external goods, let's call them, right? Wealth, prosperity, rather than internal goods of the soul, we might call them, having to do with virtue, perhaps, maybe knowledge, development of one's mind, right? So I think Confucius here is saying, look, the deepest joy is to be found in living well, cultivating the virtues, and being a good person. And if you try to gain power and wealth improperly by acting viciously or lying or cheating or acting badly, those really are have very little value. Yes, we could see that you can use the money to then buy all kinds of stuff that's shiny and good. But what's shiny and good and very attractive, maybe initially, isn't really what he thinks are the most important goods. So I really feel like a lot of these wise philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, or Mencius, these thinkers all recognize that there's a kind of hierarchy of goods. Yes, actually, and Confucius himself doesn't think wealth is inherently bad. He doesn't say that. He thinks it has a role to play, and other external goods also have a role to play as well. But the most important good always, for a lot of these thinkers, tend to be something like virtue, moral goodness, character, knowledge. And it's interesting, why they think that. I mean, I tend to agree with them. I don't know what arguments there are exactly like that we can offer. A lot of people probably be like, that's just kind of, highfalutin thought, you're living in an ivory castle. But I think all these thinkers were right. There's something more deep, more profound about these goods of the soul. Now, exactly how to argue for that, I'm not sure. It just has to do with conception of what the good is, what living well is. Do you have any thoughts about that, Jason, about this idea of hierarchy of goods, which I do think is very important?
I'm partial to this hierarchy, right? Like, I don't think wealth is as important as being a good person. But that's because, like, what we're talking about is morality, right? We are talking about ethics here. So it just seems quite obvious to me that wealth would be something like secondary, like it seems like you could be a perfectly ethical person and be poor at the same time, right? Whereas you can't be poor, you can't be a good person while also like doing all these bad immoral things, which comes, from your character. So I mean that makes perfect sense to me. But if
I
they're
think
if
the
they're
yeah.
also talking about something different, right? So maybe like because
Mhm.
I'm one of those philosophers who make a distinction between like ethics, like what's morally good and what's prudentially good, right? I can
Mhm.
see how wealth is instrumentally good for me. So in that sense, I would place value on it, but I don't think it has anything to do with me being a good person, right? It can enable me to exercise, the virtue of charity, right? But that's pretty much it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so also the other thing that I don't think I noted is a lot of these classical Confucians, they also talk about joy and how joy is connected to living well, being a morally good person, acting virtuously. So they think that there's a certain distinctive kind of profound pleasure attached to being a good person and doing what's right. Whereas I think like sometimes in the modern world, the two are kind of pitted against each other, right? So there's like the right thing to do, and that often requires tremendous sacrifice, right, of your self-interest or something like that. Whereas I think they thought, yes, maybe you have to sometimes sacrifice, some wealth or fame or power to be a good person. But being a good person itself already carries also a certain distinctive and what they would deem to be even a higher form of joy. And I think they think that came out of the fact that human beings by nature we're kind of moral animals. We deeply want to see ourselves as also good. So if we think of ourselves as living badly, being cruel, vicious, that often is kind of a painful thing. And in fact, here's evidence of that. I mean, even if when you think of we don't have to name names, but even when you think of people who are pretty bad, right, that we can think about in contemporary times, they never think of themselves really, or at least they don't really say it like that, right? They try to defend themselves. They say, no, I'm not a bad person. I'm doing this for good reasons. No one really just tends to think, oh, yeah, no, I really am a piece of crap. Like, that's not usually how the story goes because it's extraordinarily painful to think of yourself as a bad human being. And so I think the Confucians are also latching onto a deep part of our moral psychology, which is, yeah, we have desires for shiny objects, for power, for pleasure, but we also have this deep desire to be morally good and to see ourselves as good in some way. Because that's also bound up with, I think, self-respect, and not respecting yourself seems like a very bad thing for our psychic harmony. So I think that's also another thing that they're getting at there.
Cool. All right, let's do one more. All right, here is the passage. A young person who is filial and respectful of his elders rarely becomes the kind of person who is inclined to defy his superiors. Once the roots are firmly established, the way will grow. Might we not say that filial piety and respect for elders constitute the root of goodness?
Yeah. So again, I think this comes back to this idea that, well, first of all, I think when we grow up, right, we grew up usually in a family, right, with parents, or if one's adopted, other caretakers. But when you're young, you don't have a well-formed identity, you don't have a real understanding of ethics or morality. So the way we learn morality and also our identity and what's right or wrong, good or bad, is through our parents usually, right? And so I think the Confucians thought when children start early and get into habit of being able to follow what they deem to be morally good or bad. I mean, and when you're young, you just think what your parents say is right, and as you get older, you do try, you do develop some independence and understanding to the point where you could disagree with your parents and they could be wrong. But when you're young, I think the Confucians thought it's important to create a certain mindset where being able to follow what you deem to be good, which again in the early stages are what your parents say, is extremely important. Cultivating that habit, that disposition, is very, very important. And so your sense of morality grows from those early experiences in childhood. They're sort of the building blocks of your moral identity. And so I think that they thought those early years are formidable, powerful, enduring. And so when you grow up as kind of respectful children, respectful towards your parents, the laws, the rules, then you have a much higher chance of also being a good citizen, perhaps being a good member of the community, being conscientious, and so on. So I think that's I think they're trying to get at some what they perceive to be an important part of the way psychologically we develop as human beings. I think that's part of the message there.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the more you talk about this, the more conservative Confucianism sounds to me, you know?
Hmm.
And it does seem to draw on this idea that older people are wiser. There's a reason why we do things the way we do. Our traditions and rituals are like fences, right?
Hmm.
People, we
Yeah.
as a society put up these fences. And if you want to
Mhm.
take down these fences, you better have a really good reason to do so,
Yep, that's called
right?
sometimes Chesterton's fence. I think G.K. Chesterton popularized it. So it's like you're just roaming through in some area that you don't know. You come across a fence, and then some people might be like, "Wait, this fence is just in the way, right? Just let's just pull it down." The other person, maybe a bit more conservative-minded person, might say, "Oh, there's probably a reason why this fence is here. Let's maybe we should keep it up, and then maybe if it really is unnecessary, we might pull it down." But I guess it's the attitude that's different there. And
Yeah.
yeah, the more conservative minded person, maybe the Confucians are in this sense conservative, although they are willing to critique their own culture. But yeah, we'll have more of that Chesterton's fence kind of attitude, perhaps. Yeah, no, that's great. No, I think you are definitely hitting on something, and I think that's yeah the Confucians. That's why maybe they were popular at that time because they thought they were latching onto values that would perhaps create a more stable, well-ordered community. But again, I do want to acknowledge that there's other traditions that were very critical of Confucianism, like Taoism. They thought, yeah, the Confucians were kind of stuffy moralizers. They were too beholden to tradition and ritual, and we needed to find more creative perspectives to advance certain ethical values. And so the Taoists were actually a very important tradition that were kind of fighting back against the Confucians. And if we had more time, what I would try to argue is that both kind of perspectives are necessary. There's a kind of maybe a healthy tension there, and so one thing I would want to say is the Chinese traditions are very different. Like they're not monolithic. They have a wide variety of perspectives, and they disagree with each other, and which is great. I think that's what philosophy, that's what difficult questions do. They give rise to different perspectives and arguments. So that certainly existed in even the ancient Chinese traditions.
All right, well, that makes a lot of sense. That was an interesting discussion. I think I'm going to end it here. Thank you so much for being with me.
All right, this is great, Jason. Thank you so much.